Sometimes desperation drives people to make promises they can't possibly keep. When 47-year-old widow Rebecca Harrison climbed the treacherous mountain trail to James Mitchell's isolated cabin, she carried with her the most audacious proposition any woman had ever made to a man. Her 8 previous pregnancies had ended in heartbreak. Her husband was 6 months in the ground, and creditors were circling like vultures. But Rebecca believed she had one thing left to bargain with: her womb. What she didn't know was that the 35-year-old mountain hermit she sought had never touched a woman in his life, and her desperate offer would shatter both their worlds in ways neither could imagine. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The October morning mist clung to the foothills of the Cascade, mountains like a widow's veil, as Rebecca Harrison hitched her late husband's mare to the fence post outside Miller's trading post. The weathered building sat at the edge of Timber Creek, Washington Territory, the last outpost of civilization. Before the wilderness claimed everything in its path, Rebecca's hands trembled as she adjusted her black mourning dress, not from the mountain cold, but from the magnitude of what she was about to attempt. At 47, Rebecca had buried more dreams than most women her age had ever dared to dream. 8 times she had felt life quicken in her womb. 8 times she had prepared cradles, sewn tiny gowns, and whispered prayers over her growing belly. 8 times she had delivered stillborn children or watched infants slip away before their first birthdays. The doctors in Portland had called her cursed. The women in town whispered that God was punishing her for some unnamed sin. But Rebecca knew different. She knew that somewhere in the cruel mathematics of nature, she owed the world children, and she was determined to deliver them. Her husband Daniel's death from consumption 6 months earlier had left her with nothing but debt and the bitter knowledge that their 23-year marriage had produced only graves in the church cemetery. The bank would seize their farm within the month. The general store had cut off her credit. Even the church ladies, who had once brought casseroles, now crossed the street when they saw her coming, as if financial ruin might be contagious. But Rebecca had heard stories whispered in hushed tones over quilting circles and shared in the shadows of barn dances, stories about the mountain hermit who lived 2 days' ride into the Cascades, a man who had never married, never courted, never even been seen speaking to a woman for more than a few necessary words during his rare trips to town for supplies. James Mitchell had inherited his father's timber claim when he was barely 18, after both parents died in the influenza outbreak of 1856. The old-timers remembered him as a gangly, awkward boy who stammered when spoken to and turned red as autumn leaves whenever a girl looked his way. When he disappeared into the mountains after his parents' funeral, most folks assumed he'd gone to grieve in private and would return when the grief had run its course. That was 17 years ago. Since then, James had become something of a local legend. Trappers spoke of glimpsing him from a distance, a tall figure moving through the forest with the fluid grace of someone who had learned to live as much like a wild thing as a civilized man. Once or twice a year, he would appear in Timber Creek with a packed train of furs and timber, conduct his business in virtual silence, and vanish back into the wilderness before anyone could engage him in more than the most basic conversation. Stories about James Mitchell varied depending on who told them. Some claimed he was half mad from isolation, talking to trees and animals like they were people. Others insisted he was the most skilled woodsman in the territory, able to track a deer through a week-old trail and bring down a charging bear with a single shot. A few of the older women, the ones who remembered his mother, spoke of him with something approaching pity, suggesting that his retreat from society stemmed from a shyness so profound it bordered on affliction. But the story that had captured Rebecca's desperate attention was the one told by Martha Henley, the postmaster's wife, during a hushed conversation at the general store. According to Martha, who claimed to have it directly from Dr. Whitmore, James Mitchell was what polite society called untouched. A virgin at 35, too shy or too strange or too damaged by isolation to have ever known a woman's company. For most women, such a revelation would have been cause for sympathy or amusement. For Rebecca Harrison, it represented opportunity. She understood men well enough to know that certain kinds of loneliness could drive them to desperate measures. She also understood her own body well enough to know that despite 8 failures, despite the whispers and the superstitions, she was still capable of carrying a child. Her monthly courses continued regularly as clockwork. Her body remained strong from years of farm work. The doctors who had pronounced her cursed had never been able to identify any physical reason for her losses. What she needed was a man willing to give her multiple chances to succeed. What she needed was someone isolated enough that her failures wouldn't become public entertainment. What she needed was someone desperate enough for companionship to accept an arrangement that no civilized man would consider. The plan she had conceived during the sleepless nights following Daniel's funeral was audacious to the point of madness. But Rebecca had moved beyond caring about social conventions. She would ride into the mountains and find James Mitchell. She would offer herself to him not as a wife, not as a romantic partner, but as a solution to both their problems. He could have her body, her domestic skills, her companionship through the long mountain winters. In exchange, she asked only that he give her enough children to justify the 23 years she had spent failing as a mother. The trading post's bell chimed as she pushed through the door, and Sam Miller looked up from his ledger with the wary expression he reserved for customers whose credit was questionable. "Morning, Mrs. Harrison," he said carefully. "What can I do for you?" Rebecca had prepared for this conversation, knowing that information would cost her something in a place where gossip was as valuable as currency. "I need supplies for a mountain trek," she said, placing $2 silver on the counter, nearly the last of her ready money. "And I need directions to James Mitchell's claim." Sam's eyebrows rose toward his receding hairline. In all his years running the trading post, he had never had a woman ask for directions to the hermit's cabin. Men occasionally inquired, usually trappers or hunters looking to avoid territorial disputes, but women simply didn't venture into that kind of wilderness alone. "That's a rough country, ma'am," he said slowly. 2 days hard riding, and that's if the weather holds. The trail's not marked past Widow's Creek, and winter's coming early this year. Rebecca met his gaze steadily. "I have business with Mr. Mitchell." Sam studied her face, reading something in her expression that made him decide not to ask questions he might not want answered. Instead, he began gathering the supplies she would need: hardtack, dried beans, coffee, ammunition for the rifle she wore across her back, and feed for her horse. "You'll want to follow the logging road north until it peters out near Devil's Canyon," he said, sketching a rough map on brown paper. "Cross the creek at the fallen oak. You'll know it when you see it, trunks thick as a wagon wheel. From there, you follow the ridge line until you see smoke from his chimney." He paused, considering whether to voice the warning that sat heavy on his tongue. Rebecca was a grown woman, a widow who had survived more than her share of hardships, but the mountains were unforgiving, and James Mitchell was an unknown quantity. "Mrs. Harrison," he said finally, "I don't know what kind of business you got with Mitchell, but he's not like other men. 17 years alone in those mountains changes a person. Some say it's changed him more than most." Rebecca accepted the warning with a nod that acknowledged his concern without inviting further discussion. She packed her supplies into her saddlebags with the methodical efficiency of someone who had spent years managing a household with limited resources. Every item had been chosen for maximum utility and minimum weight. As she prepared to leave, Sam cleared his throat awkwardly. "If you don't mind me asking, ma'am, why Mitchell? There's plenty of men in the territory looking for wives. Good men, established men with proper homes and prospects." Rebecca turned back to face him, and for a moment Sam saw something in her eyes that made him take an involuntary step backward. It was the look of a woman who had nothing left to lose, the kind of desperate determination that made people capable of extraordinary and terrifying things. "Because, Mr. Miller," she said quietly, "established men with proper homes don't need what I'm offering." The ride into the mountains began before dawn, Rebecca navigating by starlight until the sun crested the peaks and painted the wilderness in shades of gold and crimson. Her mare, a sturdy bay named Patience, picked her way along trails that grew, progressively narrower and less defined as they climbed toward the timberline. Rebecca had always been comfortable in the wilderness. Her father had been a trapper before settling down to farm, and he had taught her to read weather patterns, to find water, to understand the subtle signs that separated safe passage from deadly miscalculation. But this journey felt different from any she had undertaken before. With each mile that separated her from civilization, she felt herself shedding not just distance, but the constraints of respectable behavior. By the time she stopped to rest at midday, Rebecca had traveled further from the accepted boundaries of feminine propriety than she had ever imagined possible. No decent woman rode alone into the mountains to proposition a hermit. No grieving widow offered her body to a stranger in exchange for children. No Christian woman bargained with her womb like it was a commodity to be traded. But Rebecca had moved beyond the luxury of respectability. She had buried her last child, a daughter who lived just long enough to open her eyes once before closing them forever, on a February morning that had frozen her heart solid. She had nursed her husband through 6 months of wasting sickness, watching consumption hollow him out until he was more ghost than man. She had sold everything of value to pay for doctors who offered sympathy but no solutions, hope but no healing. Now she had one chance left to create something meaningful from the wreckage of her life. One desperate gamble that might finally give her the children she had dreamed of since her wedding day. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The trail grew steeper as afternoon shadows lengthened, forcing Rebecca to dismount and lead Patience through sections where loose shale made footing treacherous. Her morning dress, practical as it was, had never been designed for mountain climbing, and she could feel the fabric strain against seams as she navigated rocky outcroppings and fallen timber. By evening, she had reached the fallen oak Sam Miller had described, a massive Douglas fir that had toppled across Widow's Creek during some long-ago storm. The crossing was precarious, requiring her to lead Patience carefully across the slick bark while water rushed beneath them, white and angry with snowmelt. On the far side of the creek, Rebecca made camp in a small clearing sheltered by towering pines. She had learned years ago that traveling at night in unfamiliar mountains was an invitation to disaster, and she would need all her strength and wits for tomorrow's encounter with James Mitchell. As she sat beside her small fire, eating hardtack and beans while Patience grazed nearby, Rebecca allowed herself to consider the magnitude of what she was attempting. In less than 24 hours, she would stand before a complete stranger and offer him the most intimate arrangement imaginable. She would ask him to father her children with no promise of love, marriage, or conventional partnership. The audacity of it should have frightened her. The impropriety of it should have filled her with shame. Instead, as she watched sparks rise toward the stars, Rebecca felt something she had not experienced since the early days of her marriage: hope. Somewhere above her in those dark mountains lived a man as isolated and desperate as she was. Tomorrow, she would find him and offer him a bargain that would change both their lives forever. She would promise him companionship, domestic comfort, and the kind of physical intimacy he had never known. In exchange, she would ask him to help her create the family that God had denied her for 23 heartbreaking years. It was a mad proposition, the kind of arrangement that would scandalize proper society and earn her a place in local legend as either a saint or a sinner. But as Rebecca banked her fire and settled into her bedroll under the vast canopy of stars, she found she no longer cared what proper society thought. All that mattered now was the man waiting in the mountain cabin above, and whether he was desperate enough to accept what she was prepared to offer. Dawn broke over the Cascade Peaks with the kind of crystalline clarity that comes only in the thin air of high altitude. Rebecca had been awake for an hour before sunrise, her body too tense with anticipation to remain in sleep's embrace. She broke camp methodically, checking and rechecking her supplies, while patients stood patient and alert, as if sensing the importance of the day ahead. The final ascent to James Mitchell's territory proved more treacherous than Sam Miller's rough directions had suggested. The ridgeline path was barely visible, more of a deer trail than anything designed for human passage. Rebecca found herself dismounting frequently to lead patients around washouts, where winter storms had carved new channels down the mountainside. It was nearly noon when she first caught sight of smoke rising in a thin, steady column above a tree line. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she realized she was perhaps an hour away from the most important conversation of her life. Everything she had planned, everything she had rehearsed during the long night under the stars, would soon be put to the test. The cabin, when it finally came into view through a stand of towering pines, was nothing like what Rebecca had expected. Instead of the rough shanty she had imagined, James Mitchell had built himself a substantial home. The structure was crafted from massive logs, fitted together with the precision of a master carpenter. A stone chimney rose from the center of the roof, and glass windows, real glass, not oiled paper, caught the afternoon sunlight like jewels set in timber. Outbuildings dotted the clearing. A barn large enough for several horses, a smokehouse, what appeared to be a workshop, and raised platforms that suggested extensive food storage. This was not the desperate hermit's hovel she had envisioned, but the homestead of a man who had spent years creating a self-sufficient kingdom in the wilderness. Rebecca dismounted at the edge of the clearing and stood beside Patience, suddenly uncertain how to announce her presence. Before she could decide, the cabin door opened and James Mitchell stepped onto his covered porch. The first shock was his size. Rebecca had expected the gangly, awkward boy the old-timers remembered. Instead, she found herself looking at a man who stood well over 6 feet tall, with shoulders broad enough to fill doorways and arms that spoke of years wielding axes and hauling timber. His dark hair was longer than fashion dictated, but clean and well kept. His beard, full but neatly trimmed, framed features that were strong and decidedly masculine. The second shock was his obvious prosperity. His clothing was well made and properly fitted. Wool trousers, a cotton shirt that had seen careful mending, and boots that were sturdy but not crude. This was not a man scratching out a bare existence in the wilderness. This was a man who had built himself a comfortable life far from civilization's demands. The third shock was his reaction to her presence. Rebecca had expected surprise, perhaps, alarm at finding a strange woman in his remote domain. Instead, James Mitchell looked at her with the kind of resigned recognition that suggested he had been expecting her arrival, though clearly not expecting her. "You're lost," he said, his voice carrying easily across the clearing. It was a pleasant baritone, educated and articulate. "The main trail's 5 miles south. You can water your horse at the trough, then I'll point you back toward Timber Creek." Rebecca, it took a steadying breath. This was not how she had imagined their first exchange beginning. In her mental rehearsals, she had been the one to initiate conversation, to control the direction of their interaction. Instead, she found herself having to correct his assumptions while maintaining her composure. "I'm not lost, Mr. Mitchell," she called back. "I came here specifically to speak with you." The change in his demeanor was immediate and dramatic. His shoulders tensed, his hands clenched at his sides, and something that might have been panic flickered across his features. For a moment, Rebecca saw the awkward boy the old-timers remembered, trapped inside the body of a man who had spent 17 years avoiding exactly this kind of encounter. "There's been a mistake," he said, taking a step backward toward his door. "I don't know who sent you, but I'm not interested in whatever you're selling. Take your horse to the trough, get your water, and go back where you came from." The dismissal stung, but Rebecca had not ridden 2 days into the mountains to be turned away by social awkwardness. She tied Patience to a fence rail and began walking. Across the clearing, keeping her movements slow and non-threatening, James retreated further onto his porch, but seemed caught between the desire to flee into his cabin and some ingrained courtesy that prevented him from slamming the door on. "A woman. My name is Rebecca Harrison," she said, stopping at the base of his porch steps. "I'm a widow from Timber Creek, and I've come to make you a proposition that could benefit us both." James's face had gone pale beneath his tan, and Rebecca could see the pulse beating rapidly in his throat. He reminded her of a wild animal caught in an unexpected trap, dangerous not from aggression, but from the unpredictability of pure terror. "I don't want anything you're offering," he said, though his voice had lost some of its earlier authority. "I don't need anything from town, and I certainly don't need anything from women." The way he said the word women confirmed what Rebecca had heard whispered in Martha Henley's kitchen. This was a man who had spent 17 years avoiding half the human race, who had retreated so far into isolation that the mere presence of a female had reduced him to stammering panic. Rebecca had anticipated his fear, but seeing it firsthand made her realize how delicate her approach would need to be. One wrong word, one movement that seemed too aggressive or presumptuous, and he would bolt into his cabin and refuse to emerge until she left his mountain. "Mr. Mitchell," she said gently, "I understand this is unexpected. I understand you value your privacy, and I'm not here to intrude on it. But I believe we might be able to help each other in ways that would benefit us both, without disrupting the life you've built here." James shook his head violently, as if trying to dispel some unwelcome thought. "You don't understand anything. You can't just ride up here and expect me to. I won't be trapped into something I never asked for." The word "trapped" gave Rebecca pause. What exactly did he think she was offering? What assumptions was he making about her presence, her intentions? She realized that a man who had avoided women for 17 years might have some very distorted ideas about feminine motivations and methods. "I'm not here to trap you into anything," she said carefully. "I'm here because I have a problem that conventional solutions can't solve, and I think you might have problems that conventional solutions can't solve either." "I don't have problems," James said quickly. "I have everything I need. I built all this myself. I don't need anyone's help, especially not from someone who's going to expect things." Rebecca studied his face, reading the conflict between his obvious intelligence and his paralyzing social fear. This was going to be more complicated than she had anticipated. She had prepared for resistance based on propriety or moral objections. She had not prepared for resistance based on what appeared to be genuine terror of female company. "What if I told you," she said slowly, "that I'm not asking for anything conventional, that I'm not here to disrupt your life or make demands you can't meet? What if I told you that what I'm proposing would let you keep everything exactly as it is, with some benefits you might not have considered, James's breathing had become shallow and rapid, and Rebecca realized she was witnessing something close to a panic attack. Whatever her presence represented to him, it was triggering fears so deep and primitive that rational conversation was becoming impossible. "Sit down," she said firmly, using the tone she had developed during years of nursing sick animals and frightened children. "Put your head between your knees and breathe slowly. You're going to make yourself sick carrying on like this." To her surprise, James obeyed automatically, sinking onto his porch steps and dropping his head into his hands. Rebecca waited patiently, while his breathing gradually returned to normal, using the time to reassess her strategy. Clearly, the direct approach she had planned would not work with this man. His fear of women was not just shyness or inexperience, it was something deeper and more pathological. She would need to find a way to communicate her proposal without triggering whatever trauma or conditioning had made him so terrified of feminine contact. "Better?" she asked when he finally lifted his head. James nodded reluctantly, though his eyes still held the wary alertness of a man expecting attack from an unexpected quarter. "What do you want?" he asked quietly. Rebecca chose her words with the care of someone diffusing an explosive device. "I want to tell you a story," she said, "about a woman who has spent 23 years trying to have children and failing. About a woman who is facing financial ruin because she has no family to support her and no skills that society values enough to pay for. About a woman who heard about a man living alone in these mountains and thought maybe they could solve each other's problems. I told you, I don't have problems. Everyone has problems, Mr. Mitchell. Yours might just be different from other people's." James was quiet for a long moment, studying her face with an intensity that suggested he was trying to read her true intentions. When he spoke again, his voice was carefully controlled. "What kind of problems do you think I have?" Rebecca took this as permission to continue, though she knew she was walking through a minefield of his fears and insecurities. "I think you're lonely," she said simply. "I think 17 years of complete isolation have been harder than you expected when you first came up here. I think you've built yourself a beautiful, comfortable life, but it's a life without human warmth or companionship." "I chose this life," James said defensively. "I chose to be alone, and I chose to marry a man I loved and have his children," Rebecca replied. "But choosing something doesn't mean we stop wanting things we can't have. It doesn't mean we stop being human." She could see him struggling with the concept, his logical mind fighting against emotions he had spent years suppressing. This was the opening she needed, but she would have to proceed with extraordinary delicacy. "I'm not asking you to change your life," she continued. "I'm not asking you to come back to town or rejoin society or pretend to be someone you're not. I'm asking you to consider whether there might be aspects of human companionship that you've been missing, aspects that could be added to your life without destroying what you've built." James stood abruptly, pacing to the far end of his porch, like a caged animal. "You don't understand what you're asking," he said, his voice tight with something that sounded like desperation. I don't know how to. I've never." The sentence hung unfinished in the mountain air, but Rebecca understood what he was trying to say. Martha Henley's gossip had been accurate. James Mitchell was indeed what polite society euphemistically called untouched. At 35, he had never known physical intimacy with a woman, had never experienced the basic human connection that most people took for granted. Instead of being discouraged by this revelation, Rebecca felt a surge of hope. An inexperienced man might be more willing to accept an unconventional arrangement than someone with established expectations about relationships. A man who had never known a woman's company might be more grateful for whatever companionship she could offer. "Mr. Mitchell," she said gently, "what if I told you that experience isn't necessary, that willingness to learn is more valuable than knowledge? that there are ways for two people to help each other without either one having to pretend to be something they're not? James stopped pacing and turned to face her, his expression a mixture of hope and terror. What exactly are you proposing? This was the moment Rebecca had been preparing for during the long ride into the mountains. Everything depended on how she presented her offer, how she made it seem reasonable rather than desperate, practical rather than scandalous. "I'm proposing a partnership," she said, keeping her voice steady and matter-of-fact. "You need companionship, domestic help, someone to share the long winter months with. I need security, a place to live, and the opportunity to bear children before it's too late. We could provide those things for each other without either of us having to compromise the lives we've chosen." James stared at her in stunned silence, his face cycling through expressions of disbelief, confusion, and something that might have been cautious interest. "You're talking about marriage," he said finally. "I'm talking about partnership," Rebecca corrected. "Marriage is a legal and social institution with expectations and obligations that might not suit either of us. I'm talking about two adults making a practical arrangement that serves both their needs. And children." His voice was barely above a whisper. "And children," Rebecca confirmed. "As many as my body can produce. Sons to carry on your name and help you work this land, daughters to ease the loneliness and bring life to this beautiful home you've built." The silence that followed was so complete that Rebecca could hear the wind moving through the pine needles and the distant cry of a hawk circling overhead. James stood motionless, staring at her with an expression she couldn't read. When he finally spoke, his words hit her like a physical blow. "Lady, I think you might be crazy." The word crazy hung in the mountain air between them like smoke from a poorly built fire, acrid, stinging, and impossible to ignore. Rebecca felt the accusation settle in her chest with the weight of a stone. But she had not ridden 2 days into the wilderness to be defeated by one man's harsh judgment. "Perhaps," she said evenly, meeting James's stare without flinching. "But crazy circumstances sometimes require crazy solutions, and unless you're planning to shoot me or tie me up, you're going to have to listen to what I'm offering, because I'm not leaving this mountain until I've said my piece." James took an involuntary step backward, his hand moving instinctively toward the rifle that leaned against his cabin wall. The gesture was defensive rather than threatening, but it told Rebecca everything she needed to know about how completely her presence had shattered his carefully controlled world. You can't force yourself on someone," he stammered, his voice cracking like a boy's, despite his imposing physical presence. "There are laws about women who—" "About women," Rebecca interrupted, her patience beginning to fray. "Women who make reasonable business propositions to grown men. Women who offer solutions to problems that conventional society won't address. What exactly do you think the law says about that, Mr. Mitchell?" James opened his mouth, then closed it again, clearly realizing that his knowledge of legal matters involving women was as limited as his knowledge of women themselves. He had spent 17 years in isolation, and his understanding of how the world worked had frozen somewhere around his 18th birthday. Rebecca recognized his confusion and pressed her advantage. "I'm not forcing anything on you," she said more gently. "I'm presenting you with an opportunity. You can accept it or refuse it. But either way, you're going to hear me out. Because contrary to what you might think, I didn't ride up here on some romantic whim or feminine hysteria. I came here because I've thought this through very carefully, and I believe it could work for both of us." The afternoon sun was beginning to slant lower through the pines, and Rebecca realized that regardless of how their conversation proceeded, she would need shelter for the night. The temperature was already dropping, and the clear sky that had blessed her journey was giving way to the kind of high clouds that promised weather changes in the mountains. "It's going to snow tonight," she observed, scanning the sky with the practiced eye of someone who had spent years reading mountain weather. Hard snow from the looks of those clouds. I won't make it back to Timber Creek before the storm hits. James followed her gaze upward, and she saw his shoulders slump with resignation as he recognized the truth of her assessment. Whatever his personal feelings about her presence, he was not the kind of man who would send a woman out into a blizzard, even a woman who had disrupted his peace with unwanted propositions. "There's a shelter in the barn," he said reluctantly. "Clean hay, and it's warm enough if you build a small fire in the stone ring. You can stable your horse there too." "I appreciate your hospitality," Rebecca said, though she had no intention of spending the night in a barn like a common vagrant. "But surely you have space in your cabin for one additional person. I noticed you built it quite large for a man living alone." James's face went pale again. "You can't. It wouldn't be proper. I can't have a woman in my house overnight." Rebecca almost laughed at the absurdity of his concern for propriety. Here was a man living as far from society as it was possible to get, worried about what the neighbors might think if he offered a stranded traveler shelter from a storm. "Mr. Mitchell," she said patiently, "there are no neighbors within 20 miles of this place. There's no preacher, no sheriff, no church ladies to gossip about your moral conduct. It's just you, me, and a snowstorm that's going to make travel impossible for the next several days. Under these circumstances, I think we can dispense with conventional social arrangements." The mention of several days made James visibly flinch. Rebecca could practically see his mind racing, calculating how long he might be trapped with feminine company, how many conversations he would be forced to endure, and how thoroughly his peaceful isolation was about to be shattered. "Several days," he repeated weakly. "Mountain storms don't clear quickly," Rebecca confirmed, "especially this early in the season when the snow is heavy and wet. You'll get 2 feet minimum, probably more. The trail I came up will be impassable until it melts, or gets packed down by spring travelers." James sank back onto his porch steps, his head in his hands. Rebecca felt a stab of sympathy for him, recognizing that her arrival represented everything he had spent 17 years trying to avoid. But sympathy would not solve either of their problems, and she had not come this far to be delicate about his feelings. "Look," she said, settling herself on the opposite end of the porch steps, careful to maintain enough distance that he wouldn't feel crowded. "I understand this is difficult for you. I understand you've built your life around solitude, and my presence here is disruptive, but we're both adults, and we can figure out how to coexist for a few days without anyone dying of impropriety." James lifted his head and looked at her with something that might have been cautious curiosity. "What exactly did you mean," he asked slowly, "about solving each other's problems?" Rebecca took this as permission to present her case more fully. She had spent months preparing for this conversation, and despite the unexpected complications of James's terror and prosperity, the fundamental logic of her proposal remained sound. "I meant that you have things I need, and I have things you need, and we might be able to arrange an exchange that benefits both of us without either one having to sacrifice what they value most." "Such as?" Rebecca gestured toward the impressive homestead around them. "You've built something remarkable here. This isn't just survival, this is prosperity. You have livestock, extensive food storage, craftsmanship that would be valued anywhere in the territory, but you're managing all of this alone, which means you're working from dawn to dark just to maintain what you've created." James nodded reluctantly. She had identified one of the constant pressures of his isolated life, the relentless cycle of maintenance and preparation that left little time for anything beyond basic survival. "You're also completely cut off from human society," Rebecca continued. "No conversation, no companionship, no one to share your thoughts or achievements with. No one cares if you're sick or injured. No one will notice if something happens to you." I chose that, James said, but his voice lacked conviction. And I chose to marry a man I loved and bear his children, Rebecca replied. But choosing something doesn't mean it's working out the way we hoped. She paused, watching his face as she prepared to present the heart of her proposal. I can cook, clean, preserve food, tend animals, manage a household, and keep accounts. I can provide conversation, companionship, and medical care if needed. I can help you maintain and expand what you've built here, in exchange for security, a place to live, and the opportunity to bear children. James was quiet for a long moment, turning her words over in his mind. When he spoke again, his voice was barely audible. You said you wanted 10 sons. I said I could give you 10 sons, Rebecca corrected. What I want is children, sons, daughters, it doesn't matter to me. What matters is having the chance to be a mother before my body is too old to carry life. But 10 is probably optimistic, Rebecca admitted. I'm 47 years old. Even if my body cooperates, I might have 5 good years of childbearing. Left maybe less, but I'm still having regular monthly courses, and I'm healthy and strong. There's no physical reason I can't bear children. James's face had gone red, and Rebecca realized that discussing feminine biological functions was probably as foreign and uncomfortable to him as speaking Chinese. She would need to be more circumspect in her explanations, at least until he became accustomed to her presence. The point is, she continued, I could provide you with heirs, children to help work this land and carry on what you've built, a family to ease the isolation and give meaning to all your hard work. And you would want nothing else? James asked suspiciously. No romantic expectations, no demands for marriage or things I don't know how to give? Rebecca chose her words carefully, recognizing that she was negotiating the most delicate aspect of their potential arrangement. I would like a partnership, she said. Mutual respect, fair treatment, consideration for each other's needs and preferences. But I wouldn't expect you to pretend to have feelings you don't have or to become someone you're not. But children require. James stopped, his face burning with embarrassment as he struggled to articulate what children required, without actually discussing the mechanics of their creation. Children require physical intimacy between a man and a woman, Rebecca finished matter-of-factly. I understand that. I also understand that such intimacy doesn't require romantic love or even deep affection. It requires willingness, consideration, and some basic knowledge that can be learned. The silence that followed was so profound that Rebecca could hear her own heartbeat. James sat motionless, staring at his hands, his breath coming in short, shallow bursts. She had pushed him to the very edge of his psychological comfort zone, and she knew that her next words would determine whether he fled into his cabin and refused to emerge, or whether he found the courage to consider her proposal seriously. Mr. Mitchell, she said gently, I'm not asking you to decide anything right now. I'm asking you to think about whether the life you've built here is truly complete, or whether there might be room for something more. Before he could respond, the first snowflakes began falling, large and wet and surprisingly thick for early evening. Within minutes, the ground was dusted white, and the temperature had dropped noticeably. Storm's moving in faster than I expected, Rebecca observed, pulling her shawl tighter around her shoulders. We should get the animals settled before it gets worse. James looked up at the rapidly darkening sky, then at Rebecca, then back at the sky again. She could see him wrestling with competing impulses, the desire to maintain his isolation and the practical necessity of dealing with the immediate crisis of weather and shelter. Practicality won, as Rebecca had known it would. Whatever his social Anxieties. James Mitchell had not survived 17 years in the mountains by ignoring practical necessities. "Bring your horse to the barn," he said reluctantly. "I'll show you where to stable her and get feed for the night." The barn proved to be as well built and organized as everything else on James's property. Stalls for 6 horses, though only 2, were currently occupied by James's own animals, a sturdy gelding and a pack mule. Hay storage, grain bins, tack rooms and tools arranged with the precision of someone who understood that organization could mean the difference between life and death in remote conditions. Rebecca worked alongside James in silence, both of them focused on the immediate tasks of settling patients, checking water sources, and securing feed. Despite his obvious discomfort with her presence, James moved with practiced efficiency, and Rebecca found herself impressed by his competence and forethought. "You've built something remarkable here," she said as they finished their work. "This isn't just survival, this is mastery." James glanced at her suspiciously, as if expecting mockery or manipulation. When he found only genuine appreciation in her expression, some of the tension left his shoulders. "It's taken years," he said quietly. "Trial and error, mostly. I lost a lot of animals the first few winters before I figured out proper shelter and feed storage. But you figured it out," Rebecca observed. "Most men would have given up and gone back to town. Most men have somewhere to go back to." The simple statement carried volumes of information about James's psychological state, confirming what Rebecca had suspected. His isolation was as much about having no alternative as it was about choosing solitude. He had built his mountain kingdom not just as a refuge, but as the only place where he could exist without judgment or expectation. By the time they returned to the cabin, snow was falling heavily enough that visibility was limited to a few yards. James hesitated at his own front door, clearly struggling with the reality that he was about to invite a woman into the sanctuary he had shared with no one for 17 years. "I suppose you'll need to come inside," he said finally, though he sounded like a man announcing his own execution. "I suppose I will," Rebecca agreed, though she kept her tone light to avoid increasing his anxiety. The interior of James's cabin was another surprise. Rebecca had expected rough bachelor quarters, but instead found a space that was not only functional but comfortable. Handcrafted furniture that showed real skill, windows positioned to capture maximum light, a stone fireplace that radiated warmth throughout the main room. Shelves lined with books, tools arranged with military precision, and everywhere the evidence of a man who had learned to create beauty and comfort even in isolation. "You read," Rebecca observed, examining the impressive collection of volumes that filled several floor-to-ceiling bookcases. "Books don't talk back," James replied, then seemed to realize how that sounded. "I mean, I order them from catalogs. Have them shipped to Miller's trading post." Rebecca nodded, filing away this information about his connection to the outside world. A man who read widely was a man who remained intellectually curious despite his physical isolation. That suggested possibilities for conversation and companionship that might surprise them both. "Where do you suggest I sleep?" she asked, deciding to address the practical question directly rather than allowing his anxiety to build. James gestured vaguely toward a ladder that led to what appeared to be a sleeping loft. "There's a bed up there. I mostly use it for storage now. I sleep down here by the fire in winter." Rebecca climbed the ladder to investigate and found a space that was clearly designed as sleeping quarters, but had indeed been converted to storage. Trunks, barrels, and crates filled most of the floor space, but there was a bed frame with what appeared to be a decent mattress. "This will do fine," she called down. "If you help me move a few things, I can make it quite comfortable." What followed was an hour of awkward cooperation as they rearranged the loft space and made it habitable. James maintained careful physical distance throughout the process, never allowing their hands to touch accidentally, never standing close enough that she could feel his body heat. But Rebecca noted that he worked willingly and efficiently, following her suggestions without argument. By the time they had finished, the loft had been transformed into a cozy sleeping chamber, and the storm outside had intensified to the point that the wind was howling around the cabin's eaves with a sound like distant wolves. "Looks like we're well and truly snowed in," Rebecca observed, peering out a window at the whirling white chaos beyond. James nodded grimly. "Could last 3 days, maybe more." The temperature's dropping fast. They stood in the warmth of his cabin, listening to the storm rage outside, both acutely aware that they were now committed to several days of forced coexistence in very close quarters. The immediate crisis of shelter and weather had been resolved, but the larger question of what would happen between them remained unanswered. "I should start supper," James said finally, clearly desperate for some activity that would break the uncomfortable silence. "Let me help," Rebecca replied. "After all, if we're going to be partners, we might as well start practicing." The word partners hung in the air between them, laden with implications that neither was quite ready to explore fully. But as they moved around the small kitchen space, beginning the domestic ritual of preparing a shared meal, both of them began to understand that the next few days would determine the course of both their futures. The first morning dawned crystalline and brutal, with the kind of mountain cold that turned breath to vapor and made exposed skin burn. Rebecca woke to the sound of James moving around the cabin below, his boots careful on the wooden floor as he rebuilt the fire and started coffee. Through the small loft window, she could see a world transformed. Snow piled 3 feet deep against the cabin walls, trees bent under the weight of ice, and a silence so profound it seemed to press against her eardrums. She had slept better than expected, despite the strangeness of her surroundings. The bed was comfortable, the cabin well insulated, and the storm's fury had provided a kind of white noise that masked any awkwardness about sleeping under the same roof as a man who was essentially a stranger. "Coffee's ready," James called up. To her, his voice carefully neutral, Rebecca descended the ladder to find him standing by the kitchen window, staring out at the snow-buried landscape with an expression she couldn't quite read. He had clearly been awake for some time. The fire was crackling warmly, bacon was frying in a cast-iron pan, and biscuits were browning in the oven. "How bad is it?" she asked, joining him at the window. "Bad enough," James replied. "The trail's completely blocked. Even if the snow stopped right now, it would take days for enough to melt to make passage possible." Rebecca nodded, accepting what she had already known. They were trapped together for the foreseeable future, and how they managed the next few days would determine whether her audacious proposition had any chance of success. "Can I help with breakfast?" she offered. James hesitated, clearly torn between his desire to maintain control of his domestic space and the practical recognition that cooperation would make their forced coexistence more manageable. "You can set the table," he said finally. "Plates are in that cabinet, silverware in the drawer below." As they worked around each other in the small kitchen space, Rebecca began to observe the rhythms and routines that James had developed during his years of solitary living. He moved with practiced efficiency, every motion economical and purposeful. His cooking was simple but competent. He understood flavoring and timing in ways that suggested he had learned through necessity to create palatable meals from basic ingredients. "You cook well," Rebecca observed as they sat down to eat. James shrugged. "You learn, or you eat poorly for 17 years. It was the first personal information he had volunteered, and Rebecca seized the opportunity to encourage more conversation. What was the hardest part to learn? The cooking or the other domestic tasks? "Laundry," James said without hesitation. Took me 3 winters to figure out how to get clothes properly clean without wearing them out. Ruined more shirts than I care to remember. Despite his obvious discomfort with personal questions, Rebecca detected a note of rueful humor in his voice. She filed away this information. James Mitchell was capable of finding amusement in his own mistakes, which suggested a flexibility of mind that might serve them both well. I could show you some techniques, she offered carefully. Ways to get stains out, how to preserve fabric, methods for managing laundry in winter conditions. James looked at her suspiciously. Is this part of your proposition? It's part of being a civilized human being, Rebecca replied. If we're going to be sharing this space for several days, we might as well make ourselves useful to each other. After breakfast, they settled into an awkward division of labor. James insisted on handling the outdoor chores, checking on the animals, maintaining paths to essential buildings, monitoring the storm's progress. Rebecca focused on indoor tasks, organizing the kitchen more efficiently, mending clothes she found in a basket that had clearly been neglected for months, and taking inventory of food stores to plan meals for their extended confinement. It was while examining his pantry that Rebecca made a discovery that changed her understanding of James Mitchell entirely. Hidden behind barrels of flour and beans, she found a collection of wooden toys, exquisitely carved horses, dolls with articulated joints, miniature furniture crafted with obsessive attention to detail. The workmanship was extraordinary, each piece showing hours of patient labor and genuine artistic vision. These are beautiful, she said, when James returned from his morning chores, holding up a carved rocking horse that would have been treasured by any child. James froze in the doorway, his face cycling through embarrassment, panic, and something that might have been shame. I carve things when I have time. These aren't just carvings, Rebecca said, examining the horse more closely. These are works of art. The detail, the proportions. Someone trained you to do this level of work. My father was a carpenter, James admitted reluctantly. He taught me before he died, said a man should always have a skill with his hands, something to fall back on. Rebecca set the horse down carefully and picked up one of the dolls, marveling at the delicate features and the way the limbs moved smoothly in their joints. James, these could sell for serious money in Portland or Seattle. This is furniture-quality craftsmanship. They're not for sale, James said quickly. They're just, I don't know what they're for. But Rebecca thought she understood. A man, living in complete isolation, carving toys with no children to give them to, it suggested depths of loneliness and unexpressed longing that James himself might not fully recognize. You want children, she said gently. Maybe not consciously, but part of you has been preparing for them for years. James's face went red. Those are just something to do with my hands when the evenings are long. Of course they are, Rebecca agreed, though they both knew she didn't believe it. But they're also evidence that you have skills and instincts that would serve you well as a father. The conversation was interrupted by a sound that made both of them freeze, the distant howling of wolves, closer than either had expected. James moved immediately to the window, scanning the tree line with the alertness of someone who understood that predators were a constant threat in this isolated territory. Packs moving through, he observed. The storm probably drove them down from the high country. They'll be looking for easy prey. Rebecca joined him at the window, and together they watched as dark shapes moved like shadows through the snow-laden forest. The wolves were beautiful and terrifying, wild creatures perfectly adapted to conditions that would kill most humans within hours. Are we safe? She asked. In the cabin, yes, but I'll need to check on the animals more frequently. Wolves will take livestock if they're desperate enough, and this storm has probably disrupted their usual hunting patterns. The shared concern for the animals created a natural partnership. Over the following hours, Rebecca found herself helping James with tasks that required two people, moving hay, reinforcing barriers, ensuring that water sources remained unfrozen. Despite his social anxiety, James proved to be an excellent teacher when focused on practical matters, explaining techniques and rationale with clarity and patience. "You've thought of everything," Rebecca observed as they secured the chicken coop against potential predators. "Not just survival, but prosperity. This isn't just a homestead, it's a functioning enterprise." James glanced at her, perhaps hearing something in her tone that suggested genuine respect rather than flattery. "It had to be," he said simply. "There's no room for failure when you're this far from help." As the day progressed, Rebecca began to understand that James's isolation had not been entirely negative. He had developed skills, confidence, and competence that many men living in towns never acquired. He could build, repair, hunt, preserve food, and manage complex systems that kept him not just alive but comfortable. His problem was not inability, it was the paralyzing fear of human judgment and social interaction. That evening, as they prepared supper together, Rebecca decided to test the waters of personal conversation more directly. "Tell me about your parents," she said, as they worked side by side at the kitchen counter. "What were they like?" James's hands stilled in their chopping of vegetables. "Why do you want to know?" "Because understanding where someone comes from helps you understand who they are," Rebecca replied. "And if we're going to consider any kind of partnership, I should know something about the man I'd be partnering with." James was quiet for so long that Rebecca thought he might refuse to answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was carefully controlled. "My mother was gentle," he said slowly. "Too gentle, maybe. She tried to shield me from the way other people saw me. My father was patient, but I could tell he was disappointed that his son was so different from other boys." "Different how?" James's jaw tightened. "Shy, awkward, clumsy around people. I couldn't talk to anyone without stuttering, couldn't look people in the eye. Other children made fun of me, and I never learned how to fight back or defend myself." Rebecca could picture it. A sensitive, intelligent boy who had never developed the social armor that protected other children from cruelty. No wonder he had fled to the mountains at the first opportunity. "That must have been painful," she said simply. "It was easier to be alone," James replied. "Out here, nobody can judge you. Nobody can make you feel like you're not good enough." "But nobody can appreciate you either," Rebecca pointed out. "Nobody can see your accomplishments, your skills, your intelligence. Nobody can value what you've built here." James looked at her sharply, as if surprised by her insight. "You think that matters?" "I think human beings need to be seen and acknowledged," Rebecca said. "I think complete isolation, no matter how comfortable, leaves something essential unfulfilled." They ate their supper in contemplative silence, both of them processing the day's revelations. Rebecca had learned that James was far more capable and emotionally complex than his social fears suggested. James, meanwhile, seemed to be adjusting to her presence, becoming less skittish and more willing to engage in conversation. After the dishes were cleared, James surprised her by bringing out a chess set, not the simple wooden pieces she might have expected, but an elaborate carved set that was clearly his own handiwork. The pieces were miniature sculptures, each one unique and detailed. "Do you play?" he asked. "I used to," Rebecca replied. "My husband taught me, though I was never particularly skilled." They set up the board by the fire, and Rebecca found herself studying James's face as he concentrated on the game. In the firelight, with his attention focused on strategy rather than social anxiety, he looked younger and more relaxed than she had yet seen him. "You're quite good at this," she observed, after he had captured her queen with a combination she hadn't anticipated. "Books," James replied. "I've read everything I could find on chess strategy. Theory's easier than practice when you don't have opponents to play against. Lonely way to master a game, Rebecca said. Everything's lonely when you do it alone, James admitted, then seemed surprised by his own honesty. As they played, conversation became easier and more natural. James began, asking questions about her life, her marriage, her experiences in town. Rebecca found herself sharing more than she had intended. Her grief over lost children, her struggles with Daniel's illness, her fear of growing old alone and forgetting. 8 children, James said quietly, when she mentioned her pregnancy losses. That must have been, I can't imagine that kind of pain. It's the kind of pain that changes you, Rebecca replied. Either it makes you bitter and closed off, or it makes you desperate enough to take risks you never thought possible. James nodded slowly. Like riding alone into the mountains to proposition a stranger. Like that, Rebecca agreed. They finished their game in comfortable silence, James winning handily but without gloating. As they prepared for bed, Rebecca sensed that something fundamental had shifted between them. The initial terror and hostility had given way to cautious curiosity, and curiosity was the first step toward genuine understanding. Thank you, James said as she prepared to climb to the loft. For what? For treating me like a normal person, for not acting like my awkwardness was something shameful or amusing. Rebecca studied his face in the firelight, seeing vulnerability that he was just beginning to allow her to witness. James, there's nothing abnormal about being cautious with people. There's nothing shameful about choosing solitude over judgment. You've built something remarkable here, and you've done it entirely on your own merits. That's more than most people accomplish with all the social support in the world. As she settled into her bed in the loft, Rebecca reflected on the day's discoveries. James Mitchell was not the desperate hermit she had expected, nor was he the socially stunted invalid that town gossip suggested. He was an intelligent, capable man who had been wounded by early experiences and had chosen isolation as a form of protection. But protection came at a cost, and she sensed that he was beginning to recognize the price he had paid for his safety. Tomorrow would bring new opportunities to explore whether that recognition might open the door to a different kind of future, one that included the companionship and family that his carved toys suggested he secretly longed for. The third morning brought deceptive sunshine that made the snow-covered landscape glitter like scattered diamonds, but also brought the sound that every mountain dweller dreaded, the sharp crack of timber giving way under too much weight. Rebecca woke to James shouting her name from below, his voice tight with urgency. "What is it?" she called, scrambling down the ladder still in her nightgown. "Barn roof," James said grimly, pulling on his heavy coat. "Southwest corner's starting to sag. If it collapses, we lose the animals and most of our feed stores." Rebecca rushed to the window and saw immediately what had him worried. The barn's roofline, which had been perfectly straight 2 days ago, now showed a distinct dip where snow had accumulated beyond the structure's ability to bear the load. Even as she watched, more snow slid down from the main roof to pile against the already overburdened section. "What can we do?" she asked. "Get up there and shovel it off before the whole thing comes down," James replied, though his voice carried little confidence. "The problem is it's a 2-person job. One to shovel, one to stabilize the ladder and watch for signs of collapse." Rebecca was already moving toward her clothes. "Then it's good you're not alone anymore." James stopped in the doorway, turning to stare at her. "You can't be serious. It's dangerous work, and if that roof goes while someone's on it, then we'll both be very careful," Rebecca said firmly, pulling her dress over her head. "But we're not losing those animals or your feed stores because you're too proud to accept help from a woman." The argument that followed was brief but intense. James insisted the work was too dangerous for someone without experience. Rebecca pointed out that she had spent 23 years managing a farm and was no stranger to hazardous repairs. James worried about her physical ability to handle the heavy, wet snow. Rebecca reminded him that she had ridden 2 days into the mountains alone and was considerably stronger than she looked. In the end, practical necessity trumped social convention. They needed to save the barn, and that required 2 people working in coordination. James might not like accepting help from a woman, but he liked the prospect of losing his livestock even less. The work proved every bit as treacherous as James had warned. The ladder was slippery with ice, the roof pitched at an angle that made footing precarious, and the snow was so heavy with moisture that each shovelful felt like lifting wet concrete. Worse, they could hear ominous creaking from the roof timbers with every step, a constant reminder that the structure was on the verge of catastrophic failure. Rebecca had never worked at such height in such conditions, but she forced herself to focus on the immediate task rather than the potential for disaster. James positioned himself on the ladder's base, calling out warnings about weak spots and shifting his weight to counterbalance her movements above. "Careful on that section," he shouted as she approached the worst sag. "Boards are starting to separate. Move slowly and stay close to the ridgeline." Rebecca followed his directions precisely, recognizing that his years of mountain experience made him the expert in this situation. She might have farm experience, but James understood the specific challenges of heavy snow, extreme cold, and the particular stresses that mountain conditions placed on buildings. They worked in careful coordination, Rebecca shoveling snow toward the roof's edge, while James monitored the structure's stability and adjusted their strategy based on how the timbers responded. It was exhausting, dangerous work, made more difficult by the need to communicate constantly to avoid disaster. "That's enough for now," James called after they had cleared roughly half the problematic area. "Come down and let's assess what we've accomplished." Rebecca descended carefully, her arms aching from the unfamiliar work, and her hands cramped from gripping the shovel in thick mittens. From ground level, they could see that their efforts had made a visible difference. The roof sag was less pronounced, and the creaking sounds had diminished. "Is it enough?" Rebecca asked. James studied the structure with the practiced eye of someone who had learned to read the subtle signs of structural stress. "For now," he said finally, "but if we get much more snow, we'll have to do this again." They returned to the cabin for hot coffee and a chance to warm their numb fingers, but the crisis had fundamentally changed the dynamic between them. Rebecca had proven herself capable of dangerous, physically demanding work. James had demonstrated trust in her abilities and judgment. Most importantly, they had functioned as a team under pressure, each contributing essential skills to solve a problem that neither could have handled alone. "Thank you," James said as they sat by the fire, wrapping his hands around his coffee cup. "I couldn't have managed that alone. Would have lost the barn, and probably the animals too." Rebecca studied his face, noting that the admission seemed to cost him something. James Mitchell was not a man accustomed to acknowledging dependence on others, particularly women, but the morning's crisis had forced him to confront the limitations of complete self-reliance. "You would have found a way," she said generously, "but it's easier with help." "Is this what you meant?" James asked. "About partnership? About solving each other's problems?" Rebecca nodded. "Part of it. You have skills and knowledge I lack. I have capabilities and perspectives you might not have considered. Together, we can accomplish things that neither of us could manage alone." James was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire. When he spoke again, his voice was thoughtful, rather than defensive. "I've spent 17 years believing that depending on other people was a weakness, that if I could just be self-sufficient enough, skilled enough, prepared enough, I wouldn't need anyone. And what did that get you?" "Competence," James replied. "Security. Peace. But not happiness. The question hung in the air between them, too honest to ignore and too complex to answer easily. James had built himself a life that was undeniably successful by many measures. He was prosperous, skilled, and completely independent. But Rebecca's presence had highlighted what was missing from his mountain kingdom, and he was beginning to recognize the emotional cost of his chosen isolation. "I stopped thinking about happiness years ago," he said finally, "focused on survival, then on improvement, then on perfecting systems and skills. Happiness seemed like a luxury I couldn't afford, because you thought it required things you couldn't have, like social acceptance or romantic love or conventional success." James nodded, surprised by her insight. "All the things that seemed impossible for someone like me." "But what if happiness doesn't require those things?" Rebecca asked. "What if it requires something simpler, like purpose and companionship and the satisfaction of building something meaningful?" Before James could respond, they were interrupted by a sound that made both of them freeze, the distant but unmistakable howl of a wolf in distress. Not the hunting song they had heard before, but the high, frantic cry of an animal in pain or terror. James was on his feet immediately, reaching for his rifle. "Something's wrong. That's not normal wolf behavior." They moved to the window and peered out across the snow-covered landscape. At first, Rebecca saw nothing unusual. Then James pointed toward a cluster of pine trees near the creek, and she spotted movement, dark shapes that resolved into wolves, but wolves behaving in ways that seemed frantic and disorganized. "Pack's in trouble," James observed, his voice tight with concern. "Could be injury, could be disease, could be something else entirely, but wolves don't act like that unless something's seriously wrong." "Why do you care?" Rebecca asked genuinely. "Curious. They're predators, threats to your livestock." James glanced at her, something complicated flickering across his features. "Because they're part of this place, part of what makes these mountains what they are. You can't just eliminate everything that's inconvenient and expect the balance to hold." It was a perspective that revealed yet another layer of James's character. He understood ecology, appreciated the complex relationships that maintained wilderness ecosystems. His isolation had not made him indifferent to the natural world, but rather had taught him to see his place within it rather than above it. Over the following hour, they watched the wolf pack's distress escalate. The animals were clearly agitated, circling and howling in patterns that suggested something was trapped or injured. James grew increasingly restless, moving between windows and checking his equipment with the unconscious preparations of someone. "Considering action. You're thinking about helping them," Rebecca observed. James stopped his pacing and looked at her with surprise, as if she had read his thoughts. "The idea crossed my mind. It's dangerous. Everything worthwhile is dangerous." Rebecca studied his face, recognizing something she hadn't seen before. A man struggling between his natural inclination to help and his trained instinct for self-preservation. James Mitchell might have retreated from human society, but he had not lost his essential humanity, and that humanity was now in conflict with 17 years of cautious isolation. "What would helping them involve?" she asked. "Getting close enough to see what's wrong. If it's an injured pack member, maybe putting the animal out of its misery. If something's trapped, maybe freeing it. If it's disease..." He shrugged. "Not much anyone can do about that. And the danger to us. Wolves are unpredictable when they're stressed. Even if they're not naturally aggressive toward humans, desperation can make any animal dangerous. Plus, getting close enough to help means leaving the safety of the cabin and moving through terrain where we'd be vulnerable." Rebecca considered this information carefully. Everything logically suggested they should stay safe and warm in the cabin, let nature take its course regardless of the wolves' distress. But logic was not the only consideration. How they responded to this crisis would reveal something important about both of them. about their willingness to take risks for others, about their capacity for compassion, even toward potential threats. "I think we should help," she said finally. James stared at her in shock. It could be extremely dangerous. So could barn roofs collapsing. So could riding alone into the mountains to proposition a hermit. "I'm discovering that the most worthwhile things in life tend to involve some degree of risk." The look James gave her was complicated. Gratitude, concern, and something that might have been admiration. "You realize this could go badly? That we could end up injured or worse?" "I realize that," Rebecca replied. "I also realize that how we handle this will tell us something important about what kind of partners we might be. Do we only help each other when it's safe and convenient, or do we take risks for things that matter?" James was quiet for a long moment, weighing her words against his instincts for caution. When he spoke again, his voice carried the determination of a man who had made a difficult decision. "All right," he said. "But we do this carefully, methodically, and we retreat the moment things look dangerous. Agreed?" "Agreed." They spent the next hour preparing for what might be the most dangerous undertaking either had attempted in years. James checked his rifle and loaded extra ammunition. Rebecca gathered medical supplies in case they encountered injured animals or became injured themselves. They discussed strategies, escape routes, and contingency plans with the thoroughness of people who understood that poor preparation could mean death in the wilderness. As they prepared to leave the safety of the cabin, Rebecca felt a mixture of fear and exhilaration that she had not experienced since her youth. She was about to risk her life alongside a man she had known for only 3 days, for the sake of animals that posed a potential threat to their safety. By any reasonable standard, it was foolish to the point of madness. But it was also the first time in years that she had felt truly alive, truly engaged with something that mattered beyond mere survival. And as she watched James check his equipment with professional competence, she realized that this crisis was testing not just their individual courage, but their ability to function as partners in circumstances where failure could cost them everything. The wolves' distress calls continued to echo across the snow-covered landscape, a sound that spoke of desperation and the kind of primal need that transcended species boundaries. In a few minutes, she and James would venture out into that dangerous, beautiful wilderness to see if 2 humans could make a difference in a situation where compassion mattered more than safety. It was exactly the kind of test that would reveal whether Rebecca Harrison and James Mitchell had any chance of building a life together, or whether her desperate proposition would prove to be nothing more than a dangerous delusion. The approach to the wolf pack required moving through snow that reached their knees in places, each step deliberate and calculated to avoid sudden movements that might trigger aggressive responses from already distressed animals. James led the way, rifle ready but not raised, while Rebecca followed closely behind, carrying the medical supplies and watching for signs of danger from directions he couldn't monitor. As they drew closer to the source of the distress calls, the nature of the crisis became clear. A juvenile wolf, perhaps 8 months old, had become trapped beneath a fallen branch weighted down with ice and snow. The rest of the pack, 5 adults, circled the trapped animal in growing agitation, their howls carrying notes of desperation that transcended species boundaries. "Can we free it?" Rebecca whispered, studying the situation from behind a cluster of pine trees. James examined the trap carefully, noting the size of the branch, the angle of the pin, and the behavior of the pack animals. "Maybe," he said quietly. "The branch isn't enormous, but it's wedged against that boulder. I would need to lift and shift it at the same time. 2-person job? Definitely, 1 to lift, 1 to pull the wolf free, but those adults aren't going to just stand by and let strangers handle their pack member." They watched for several more minutes, studying the pack dynamics and looking for any opportunity that might allow them to help without triggering an attack. The trapped juvenile was weakening visibly, its struggles becoming less frequent and less vigorous. "We need to do something soon," Rebecca observed. "That animal doesn't have much time left." James nodded grimly. The ethical dimension of their situation was becoming clear. They could retreat to safety and let nature take its course, or they could risk their lives to save a creature that would normally be considered a threat to their livelihood. "The adults will need to be distracted," James said finally, "drawn away long enough for us to free the juvenile and get clear before they return." "How do we distract 5 wolves?" James was quiet for a moment, considering options that all seemed to involve unacceptable levels of risk. Finally, his face set in lines of determination that Rebecca was beginning to recognize. "I'll create a diversion upstream," he said. "Fire, a shot into the air, make noise, draw them away from the trapped animal. When they investigate, you move in and free the juvenile." Rebecca stared at him in horror. "That puts you alone and exposed with 5 agitated wolves between you and safety. If something goes wrong, then you get back to the cabin as fast as you can and don't look back," James interrupted. "This was my idea. I'm not letting you take the biggest risk." The argument that followed was whispered but intense. Rebecca insisted that she was capable of creating the diversion herself. James pointed out that she lacked his knowledge of wolf behavior and wilderness survival skills. Rebecca countered that she was smaller and potentially less threatening to the animals. James replied that he was faster and stronger if retreat became necessary. In the end, they compromised on a plan that divided the risks more evenly. James would position himself where he could provide cover with his rifle if the adults became aggressive. Rebecca would approach the trapped juvenile, working to free it, while James monitored the pack's behavior and provided warnings about changing threat levels. It was still dangerous, potentially fatally so, but it gave them both active roles and maximized their chances of success while minimizing the risk to either individual. They moved into position with the careful choreography of people whose lives depended on perfect execution. James found a spot with good sight lines and cover, where his rifle could provide protection without making him an obvious target. Rebecca approached the trapped animal from an angle that would allow quick escape if the adults decided she represented a threat. The juvenile wolf watched her approach with eyes that held pain, exhaustion, and a surprising lack of fear. Perhaps desperation had overridden natural wariness, or perhaps the animal somehow sensed that she meant no harm. Rebecca spoke to it in low, soothing tones as she examined the trap, the way she had once spoken to injured farm animals. "Easy now," she murmured, assessing the best angle to lift the branch without causing additional injury. "We're going to get you out of this." The branch was heavier than it looked, weighted with ice and positioned at an awkward angle that made leverage difficult. Rebecca had to brace her feet carefully in the snow and use her entire body to generate lifting force. The juvenile whimpered as the pressure shifted, but seemed to understand that she was trying to help. "Almost," she whispered, feeling the branch begin to give way. "Just a little more." Behind her, she could hear James's quiet voice, providing updates on the adult wolves' positions and behavior. They had noticed her presence but seemed confused by her actions, moving restlessly but not yet committing to either attack or retreat. With a final surge of effort, Rebecca managed to lift the branch high enough for the juvenile to pull itself free. The young wolf scrambled to its feet unsteadily, favoring one leg but apparently not seriously injured. For a moment, it stood looking at her with what seemed like gratitude, then it limped quickly toward the adult pack. The reunion was immediate and emotional, the adults surrounding the juvenile with behaviors that spoke clearly of relief and affection. For several minutes, they seemed to forget entirely about the humans who had facilitated the rescue, focused entirely on checking their pack member for injuries and reassuring themselves of its safety. "Time to go," James said quietly, appearing at Rebecca's side, "before they remember we're here and decide we might be a threat." They retreated carefully, moving slowly to avoid triggering pursuit responses, but steadily enough to put distance between themselves and the reunited pack. Only when they were well clear of the immediate area did Rebecca allow herself to feel the full impact of what they had accomplished. "We did it," she said, surprising herself with the intensity of emotion in her voice. "We actually saved that animal." James looked at her with an expression she had never seen before, something that combined admiration, gratitude, and a kind of wonder. "You did it," he corrected. "You were the one who took the real risk, who did the actual work of freeing the wolf." "We both did it," Rebecca insisted. "Neither of us could have managed it alone." They walked back toward the cabin in companionable silence, both processing the implications of what had just occurred. They had faced genuine danger together, made decisions that prioritized compassion over safety, and succeeded in accomplishing something that required both their skills and courage. More importantly, they had chosen to act based on shared values, rather than individual self-interest. The trapped wolf had represented no benefit to either of them. Indeed, a healthy wolf pack posed potential threats to James's livestock. But they had risked their safety to help anyway, because the alternative felt morally unacceptable. "Rebecca," James said as they approached the cabin, "I need to tell you something." She turned to look at him, noting the serious tone in his voice. "What is it?" "These past few days. Spending time with you, working together, seeing how you handle challenges." He paused, struggling with words that seemed inadequate for what he was trying to express. "I haven't felt this alive, this engaged with life in 17 years. Rebecca felt her heart begin to race, recognizing that they were approaching the conversation that would determine both their futures. "Well, what are you saying?" "I'm saying that your proposition, your offer of partnership, I want to consider it seriously. Not because I'm desperate or lonely, though God knows I've been both, but because I think we might actually be good together." They had reached the cabin's front porch, but neither moved toward the door. This conversation was too important to be interrupted by the mundane necessities of removing coats and boots. "What changed your mind?" Rebecca asked. James considered the question carefully. "Watching you on that barn roof, seeing how you handled danger without falling apart, the way you talked about the wolves, about taking risks for things that matter. The way you've treated me, not like I'm some kind of damaged hermit, but like I'm a person worth knowing." He paused, gathering courage for what came next. "And realizing that everything I've built here, all this prosperity and security, doesn't mean much if there's no one to share it with. No one to care about it, no one to benefit from it after I'm gone." Rebecca studied his face, reading sincerity and vulnerability that he had never allowed her to see before. "And the physical aspects? The intimacy that children would require?" James's face reddened, but he didn't look away. "I won't pretend I'm not terrified. I have no experience, no knowledge of how to be a husband in that way. But I'm willing to learn. If you're patient with me, if you can teach me what I need to know." "James," Rebecca said gently, "physical intimacy isn't complicated. It requires trust, consideration, and willingness to communicate. Everything else can be learned. And children? You really believe it's possible? At your age, given your history?" Rebecca had asked herself the same question countless times during her journey to find him. "I don't know," she admitted. "I can't promise you 10 sons or even 1 child, but I can promise you that we'll try, and that whatever happens, you'll have a partner who values what you've built and wants to help you build more." James nodded slowly, accepting both the honesty and the uncertainty her words contained. "What about love?" he asked quietly. "I don't know if I'm capable of the kind of romantic feeling that marriages are supposed to be built on." "Neither do I," Rebecca replied. I love Daniel deeply, but that love grew over years of shared experience. What I feel for you now is respect, admiration, and genuine affection. Maybe that will grow into something deeper. Maybe it won't. But it's a foundation we can build on. They stood facing each other in the gathering dusk, two people who had found their way to an understanding that defied conventional expectations, but made perfect sense for their particular circumstances. "So we're really doing this?" James asked. "We're going to attempt this partnership?" "If you're willing," Rebecca replied. "If you think you can handle sharing your mountain kingdom with a woman who has opinions and isn't afraid to express them." James smiled, the first genuinely relaxed, happy expression she had seen from him. "I think I might like that more than I expected." As they finally entered the warmth of the cabin, Rebecca felt a sense of completion that had nothing to do with romantic fulfillment and everything to do with finding her place in the world. She had gambled everything on the possibility that two damaged, desperate people might be able to create something meaningful together. The gamble appeared to be paying off. Outside, the first howl of the evening rose from the forest. Not the distressed cry they had heard earlier, but the strong, healthy voice of the juvenile wolf they had freed, calling to its pack in the gathering darkness. It was a sound that spoke of survival, of family bonds, and of the unexpected ways that courage and compassion could change the course of individual lives. James reached for Rebecca's hand as they stood listening to the wolf song, and she felt the calluses on his palm, the strength in his fingers, the tentative beginning of a connection that might grow into something neither of them had dared to hope for. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to test their partnership against the realities of building a life together. But tonight, warmed by firelight and the knowledge that they had chosen each other freely and honestly, two unlikely partners began the delicate work of imagining a future that included the children James had been carving in wood and the family Rebecca had been dreaming of for 23 heartbreaking years. 2 years had passed since Rebecca Harrison first climbed the mountain trail to propose her audacious bargain to James Mitchell, and the woman who now stood in the doorway of the trading post bore little resemblance to the desperate widow who had once begged Sam Miller for directions to a hermit's cabin. Rebecca Mitchell, she had taken his name in a simple ceremony performed by a traveling preacher the previous spring, carried herself with the confidence of a woman who had found her place in the world. More importantly, she carried their first child. At 49, Rebecca was 6 months pregnant with what Dr. Whitmore from the territorial capital had pronounced a remarkably healthy pregnancy. After 8 devastating losses, after decades of failed hopes and buried dreams, her body had finally accepted the gift of life. The child moved restlessly beneath her heart as she conducted business in town, as if eager to join the world that his parents were building together. Mrs. Mitchell, Sam Miller greeted her with the respectful warmth he reserved for customers, who had earned his genuine regard. "James with you today?" "Loading supplies at the lumber yard," Rebecca replied, accepting his help with the heavy bolt of fabric she had come to purchase. "We're adding another room to the cabin before winter. Someone's going to need a proper nursery." Sam's weathered face creased into a smile. The transformation of the mountain hermit and his unlikely bride had become something of a local legend, discussed in approving tones around dinner tables throughout the territory. Their success had validated the possibility that unconventional partnerships might succeed where traditional arrangements failed. "How's he talking to the prospect of fatherhood?" Sam asked. Rebecca's smile held layers of memory and affection. "Like a man who's been preparing for it his whole life without realizing it. You should see the cradle he's building. More like a work of art than a piece of furniture. And the toys." She shook her head in amazement. "He's carved enough animals to populate Noah's Ark. The truth was that James had embraced impending fatherhood with an intensity that sometimes surprised even Rebecca. The shy, terrified man she had first encountered had been replaced by someone who discussed baby care with the same methodical thoroughness he applied to livestock management. He had read every book on child-rearing that could be ordered from, catalogues, consulted with Dr. Whitmore about proper prenatal care, and begun planning educational activities for a child who wouldn't be walking for years. "And the other news?" Sam asked, lowering his voice conspiratorially. "About young Peterson?" Rebecca nodded, understanding his reference. Word had spread about their recent visitor, Marcus Peterson, a shy 22-year-old who had sought them out after hearing their story from a traveling merchant. Marcus had been struggling with social anxieties that reminded both James and Rebecca of James's own early difficulties, and he had hoped they might offer guidance for someone trying to find his place in an unforgiving world. The young man had stayed with them for 3 weeks, learning practical skills from James while absorbing Rebecca's perspectives on overcoming social fears and building confidence. When he left, it was with a letter of introduction to a widow in the next county who was looking for help managing her late husband's farm, a woman who valued competence over social graces and might appreciate Marcus's gentle nature. "He's doing well," Rebecca reported. "Mrs. Bradley wrote to say she's never had more reliable help, and Marcus seems to be gaining confidence daily. They've been discussing the possibility of a more permanent arrangement. It was not the first time people had sought them out for advice or guidance. Something about their success story, the desperate widow and the terrified hermit who had created a thriving partnership against all expectations, seemed to offer hope to others struggling with unconventional situations." James appeared in the doorway of the trading post, his presence immediately commanding attention despite his continued discomfort with public spaces. 2 years of marriage had not cured his social anxieties, but they had given him tools for managing them and confidence that came from knowing he had someone who understood his struggles. "Ready?" he asked Rebecca, though his eyes lingered protectively on her pregnant form. "Almost," she replied, completing her transaction with Sam Miller. "Just finished telling Sam about Marcus's progress." James nodded approvingly. The young man's visit had awakened something in both of them, a recognition that their story might serve as encouragement for others facing similar challenges. They had begun receiving letters from people across the territory, some seeking advice, others simply wanting to share their own stories of finding love and purpose in unexpected circumstances. As they prepared to leave town, they were approached by a woman Rebecca didn't recognize, perhaps 30 years old, well-dressed, but with the kind of careful composure that suggested she was holding herself together through sheer will. "Excuse me," the woman said hesitantly. "Are you the Mitchells, James and Rebecca Mitchell?" "We are," Rebecca replied gently, recognizing something familiar in the woman's expression, the desperate hope of someone clinging to a last possibility. "My name is Catherine Walsh," the woman continued. "I've traveled from Oregon Territory to speak with you. I heard about you, about how you found each other, and I wondered if you might spare some time for someone in somewhat similar circumstances." James glanced at Rebecca, reading the compassionate response in her eyes that he had come to expect and admire. Despite their eagerness to return home, they would not turn away someone who had traveled so far for help. "Of course," Rebecca said. "Would you like to come up to our homestead? We can offer you a meal and a place to stay while we talk." The story that emerged during the ride up the mountain was both familiar and unique. Catherine Walsh was a widow, with 2 young children, facing financial ruin after her husband's death in a mining accident. She had heard about their unconventional partnership and wondered if there might be similar arrangements available for women with children, men who might value companionship and domestic skills more than youth or traditional romantic attraction. Not asking for charity, Catherine explained, as they shared supper around the table James had built with his own hands. I can work, I can contribute, I can be a true partner to the right man. But I have children to consider, and I need to find a situation that will provide security for all of us. James listened thoughtfully to her story, occasionally asking practical questions about her skills and experience. Rebecca watched him carefully, noting how he had grown from the terrified hermit she had first encountered into a man capable of offering genuine guidance to others facing difficult choices. There are men, James said finally, good men who might value what you're offering, but finding them requires understanding what you're truly seeking and being honest about what you can provide. Over the following days, they helped Catherine develop a clearer understanding of her situation and options. James shared insights about the kinds of men who might be open to unconventional arrangements, widowers struggling with domestic responsibilities, established bachelors facing loneliness, men in remote areas who valued practical skills over social polish. Rebecca offered perspectives on presenting herself honestly while emphasizing her strengths, on protecting her children's interests while remaining open to new possibilities, on recognizing genuine partnership opportunities versus situations that might exploit her desperation. Most importantly, they both emphasized the crucial importance of mutual respect and shared values in any successful partnership, regardless of how it might appear to outside observers. What you and James have, Catherine observed on her final evening with them. It's not what I expected when I heard about the mountain hermit and his mail-order bride. You're not just surviving together, you're thriving. You've built something beautiful. Rebecca glanced around the cabin that had become truly home over the past 2 years. James had expanded and improved it continuously, adding windows to capture mountain views, building custom furniture designed for their specific needs, creating spaces that served both practical and aesthetic functions. The walls now displayed some of his finest wood carvings alongside quilts Rebecca had sewn during long winter evenings. Bookshelves held volumes they had read aloud to each other, their pages marked with conversations and shared discoveries. The kitchen functioned with the efficiency of 2 people who had learned to work in perfect coordination. But beyond the physical improvements, the space radiated the warmth of genuine partnership. This was a home where 2 people had learned to appreciate each other's strengths, accommodate each other's weaknesses, and create something greater than the sum of their individual capabilities. We were both desperate when we found each other, Rebecca acknowledged. But desperation can be a starting point rather than a destination if you're willing to build something honest from it. James nodded, adding his own perspective. People assume that unconventional partnerships must be somehow lesser than traditional romantic marriages. But partnership built on mutual respect and shared goals can be just as meaningful as any other, a kind of love. After Catherine departed with letters of introduction to several potentially suitable men, James and Rebecca settled into the comfortable rhythms of their evening routine. Rebecca worked on tiny garments for their expected child, while James put finishing touches on the cradle he'd been crafting for months. "Do you think she'll find what she's looking for?" Rebecca asked, pausing in her sewing to watch James's. "Careful work with sandpaper and polish. I think she has a better chance now than when she arrived," James replied. "She understands what she's offering and what she needs. That's more than most people can say when they're making important life decisions." Rebecca considered this observation, thinking about how many people stumbled into marriages or partnerships without clear understanding of their own needs or capabilities. She and James had been forced by circumstances to be brutally honest about their limitations and desires, and that honesty had become the foundation of their success. "I've been thinking," she said, "about all the people who've come to us for advice, all the letters we've received. There seem to be many more people in unconventional situations than I ever realized." James looked up from his work, interested in her developing thought. And perhaps there's a need for more formal ways of helping them find each other. Not the kind of agency that deceived you with promises they couldn't keep, but something more honest. Something that helps people understand what they're really looking for and connects them with others who might be compatible. It was an intriguing possibility. Both of them had received enough correspondence from people in desperate circumstances to recognize that their situation was not unique. Widows facing financial ruin, bachelors struggling with isolation, families disrupted by death or economic hardship, all seeking alternatives to conventional social arrangements. "It would require careful thought," James said slowly. "Ways to verify people's honesty, methods for ensuring safety, systems for helping people understand their own needs before they try to meet someone else's. But it could help people avoid some of the mistakes we made," Rebecca added. "The false expectations, the panic when reality didn't match assumptions, the time wasted on misunderstandings that could have been prevented." They discussed the possibility late into the evening, sharing ideas about how such a service might work, what safeguards would be necessary, how to distinguish between genuine seekers and those who might exploit desperate people. It was a conversation that would continue over many months and eventually evolve into a small but successful service, helping people in unconventional situations find compatible partners. But that night, it was simply two people who had found happiness together, imagining ways to help others achieve similar success. As they prepared for bed, Rebecca felt their child move restlessly beneath her heart. Strong, healthy movements that promised life after so many years of death and disappointment. She placed James's hand on her swelling belly, watching his face light up with wonder as he felt his son or daughter responding to his touch. "Still can't quite believe it's real," he murmured, his palm warm against her skin. "Neither can I," Rebecca admitted. "After so many failures, so many losses, sometimes I'm afraid to hope too much." "But you are hoping." "Every day," she replied, "and not just for this child, but for all the possibilities we're creating together. The family we'll build, the life we'll share, the ways we might help others find what we've found." Outside their mountain refuge, snow was beginning to fall. Again, the first storm of another winter that they would face together. But now the approach of cold weather brought anticipation rather than dread. There would be long evenings by the fire, books to read aloud, projects to complete, and quiet conversations about their growing family and expanding dreams. James banked the fire for the night, while Rebecca climbed carefully to their shared sleeping space, no longer the loft where she had spent those first awkward nights, but a proper bedroom James had built as their relationship evolved from desperate arrangement to genuine partnership to something that looked remarkably like love. As they settled into bed together, Rebecca reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. 2 years ago, she had been a widow facing destitution, desperate enough to ride alone into the mountains to proposition a stranger. James had been a terrified hermit, so paralyzed by social anxiety that the mere presence of a woman had reduced him to panic. Now they were partners in the truest sense, two people who had learned to appreciate each other's strengths, support each other's weaknesses, and build something meaningful from the raw materials of mutual need and tentative affection. Their story would become part of local legend, told around fires and repeated in letters, inspiring others to believe that unconventional partnerships might succeed where traditional arrangements had failed. Children would be born from their union, carrying forward the legacy of two people who had chosen each other freely and built something lasting from desperation and hope. But tonight, as snow fell softly outside their windows, and their first child moved restlessly beneath Rebecca's heart. They were simply James and Rebecca Mitchell, a man and woman who had gambled everything on the possibility that partnership, respect, and mutual need might grow into something that looked remarkably like happiness. The mountain wind sang through the pines with voices that sounded almost like children laughing, promising spring mornings filled with new possibilities and the endless potential that comes from choosing love over fear, hope over resignation, and partnership over solitude. The following spring brought changes that neither Rebecca nor James had anticipated. Their son, for the child had indeed proven to be male, as healthy and vigorous as any parent could hope, arrived during a fierce April snowstorm that seemed determined to mark his entrance into the world with dramatic flourish. Thomas Daniel Mitchell, named for both Rebecca's late husband and James's father, possessed his mother's grey eyes and what appeared to be his father's large hands and steady temperament. Dr. Whitmore, who had stayed at the homestead for 3 days due to the storm, pronounced it one of the smoothest deliveries he had witnessed in 20 years of frontier medicine. Rebecca's body, despite her age and previous losses, had carried and delivered the child with remarkable ease. James, who had prepared for the birth with characteristic thoroughness, proved surprisingly capable as an assistant, following medical instructions with calm precision despite his obvious terror at seeing Rebecca in pain. "You have a natural talent for this," Dr. Whitmore observed, as James expertly swaddled the newborn while Rebecca rested. "Many men become completely useless during childbirth, but you've been genuinely helpful." James looked down at his son with an expression of wonder that made Rebecca's heart ache with tenderness. Here was the shy, terrified hermit transformed into a competent father, holding his child with the same careful attention he brought to all his important work. "I read everything I could find about infant care," James admitted. "Ordered medical texts, midwifery manuals, anything that might help me understand what Rebecca would need." The weeks following Thomas's birth revealed new dimensions of their partnership. James proved as methodical about fatherhood as he was about everything else, maintaining detailed records of feeding times, sleep patterns, and developmental milestones. Rebecca, meanwhile, found herself marveling at how naturally maternal instincts returned, despite the 23-year gap since her last pregnancy. But perhaps the most surprising development was how parenthood affected their relationship with the broader community. Word of the baby's arrival spread quickly through the territory, and they began receiving visitors in numbers that would have sent James into panic attacks just years earlier. The first to arrive was Marcus Peterson, now married to Mrs. Bradley and managing her farm with quiet competence. He brought gifts for the baby and news that 3 other couples had formed partnerships based on advice they had received from James and Rebecca. "You've started something?" Marcus told them as he held young Thomas with the careful reverence of someone hoping to become a father himself soon. "People are talking about different ways to build families, different kinds of marriages that might work better for some folks than traditional arrangements." Mrs. Henderson from the boarding house in Timber Creek arrived with a delegation of church women, ostensibly to check on Rebecca's recovery, but clearly curious about how the unconventional couple was managing parenthood. Their disapproving expectations were quickly dispelled by the obvious health and contentment of both mother and child, and the meticulous care James provided for his family. "Well," Mrs. Henderson admitted grudgingly as she prepared to leave, "I suppose there are different ways to make a marriage work. Can't argue with the results when you see them." Even more surprising was the arrival of territorial officials who had heard about James and Rebecca's informal counseling service and wanted to discuss the possibility of establishing more formal programs to help widows and unmarried men find suitable partnerships. "The territory's growing fast," explained Judge Harrison from the capital. We're seeing increasing numbers of people in difficult circumstances, widows with children, bachelors struggling with isolation, families disrupted by mining accidents or illness. Traditional matchmaking isn't serving everyone's needs. James listened carefully to the judge's proposals, occasionally glancing at Rebecca for her thoughts. The idea of formalizing their advice-giving into an official service appealed to both of them, but they understood the complexities involved. Any such program would need careful safeguards, Rebecca pointed out, shifting Thomas to her other arm as she spoke. Too many vulnerable people could be exploited by those with less honorable intentions. Agreed, Judge Harrison replied. That's why we need people with experience and integrity to help design the system, people who understand both the possibilities and the pitfalls. The conversation continued over several visits, eventually resulting in James and Rebecca agreeing to serve as consultants for a territorial program designed to help people in unconventional circumstances find suitable partnerships. It would not be a marriage brokerage in the traditional sense, but rather an educational service that helped people understand their own needs and connect with others who might be compatible. Summer brought new challenges as Thomas grew from infant to increasingly active baby. James proved surprisingly adept at incorporating childcare into his daily routines, fashioning a career that allowed him to work outdoors while keeping the baby close. Rebecca marveled at how naturally he had adapted to fatherhood, treating it, as he did everything else, a skill to be learned and perfected through careful attention and practice. "You're going to spoil that child," she observed one evening, as James carved yet another toy animal for Thomas's growing collection. "A man should have options," James replied seriously, though Rebecca caught the hint of humor in his voice. "When he's ready to play, he'll have choices about what interests him most." The correspondence they received continued to grow in volume and complexity. Letters arrived from across the Western Territories, some seeking advice about specific situations, others simply wanting to share stories of successful unconventional partnerships. Rebecca found herself spending several hours each week crafting thoughtful responses, while James developed form letters for common questions and situations. One particularly poignant letter came from a woman in California whose circumstances so closely mirrored Rebecca's original situation that it might have been written by her younger self. "I am a widow of 42 years with no family to support me and few marketable skills. I have heard of your successful partnership and wonder if you might advise me on finding a similar arrangement. I am not seeking romance or passion, but security and the opportunity to be useful to someone who might value companionship and domestic assistance more than youth and conventional beauty." Rebecca spent an entire evening crafting her response, drawing on everything she had learned about presenting oneself honestly while emphasizing strengths, about recognizing genuine partnership opportunities, and about maintaining dignity while acknowledging desperation. "The key," she wrote, "is understanding that desperation can be a starting point rather than a permanent condition. Focus on what you can contribute rather than what you lack, and seek men who value partnership over possession, companionship over conquest." Autumn brought their first anniversary, marked not by romantic celebration, but by quiet reflection on how completely their lives had changed. They sat on their expanded porch, Thomas sleeping peacefully in James's arms, watching the aspens turn gold against the backdrop of snow-capped peaks. "Do you ever regret it?" Rebecca asked. "The disruption to your peaceful isolation, the constant stream of visitors and correspondence, the responsibilities of family." James considered the question with characteristic seriousness. "I regret that it took me so long to understand what I was missing," he said finally. 17 years of believing that safety was more important than connection, that independence was more valuable than partnership. He shifted Thomas slightly, marveling as always at how perfectly the baby fit against his chest. "What about you? Any regrets about your desperate mountain expedition to proposition a hermit?" Rebecca laughed, the sound carrying across the clearing like music. "Only that I waited so long to try. Imagine if I had found the courage 10 years earlier. We might have had time for those 10 sons I promised you. 1 healthy son and a partnership." "That works," James replied. "That seems like abundance to me." As winter approached, they received news that would test their partnership in ways they had not anticipated. Dr. Whitmore arrived with information that a family in the next valley had been struck by diphtheria, leaving 3 young children orphaned and no relatives willing to take them in. "They're good children," the doctor explained, "ages 4, 6, and 8. The oldest girl has been trying to care for her younger siblings, but they need proper adult supervision. The territorial authorities are looking for families willing to take them, either temporarily or permanently." Rebecca felt her heart constrict at the thought of 3 children facing the kind of abandonment she had feared for herself. But taking in orphans would mean expanding their family dramatically, testing their resources and their still new stability as parents. "What do you think?" she asked James after Dr. Whitmore had left. James was quiet for a long time, bouncing Thomas gently while staring into the fire. When he finally spoke, his words carried the weight of careful consideration. "I think we have room," he said slowly. "Not just physical space, but emotional capacity. I think we've been fortunate enough to find happiness that we might owe it to others to share what we can." The decision to take in the Caldwell children, Sarah aged 8, Michael aged 6, and little Emma aged 4, proved transformative for everyone involved. The children arrived frightened, grieving, and uncertain about their place in the world. But they also brought energy, laughter, and the kind of joyful chaos that had been missing from the too quiet mountain homestead. Sarah proved to be a natural helper with Thomas, possessing maternal instincts that belied her young age. Michael showed aptitude for James's woodworking, following him around the workshop with eager curiosity. Emma, despite her shyness, had a gift for finding wonder in small things: carved animals, wildflowers, the play of sunlight through pine. "Needles. We're going to need a bigger house," Rebecca observed one evening as they watched the older children play with Thomas while Emma helped prepare supper. "Already drawing up plans," James replied. "Thinking we might need to add proper bedrooms, maybe expand the workshop so Michael can learn woodworking safely." The expansion of their family coincided with the formal launch of the Territorial Partnership program they had helped design. Letters of inquiry poured in from government officials, church leaders, and community organizers across the Western Territories, all seeking guidance on helping people in unconventional situations find suitable partnerships. James and Rebecca found themselves traveling occasionally to nearby towns, speaking to groups about their experiences and offering guidance on establishing local programs. It was terrifying for James initially, but he discovered that when speaking about subjects he understood deeply, his social anxiety diminished considerably. "The key principle," he would tell audiences, "is honesty about limitations and realistic expectations. Partnerships built on false premises fail quickly, but those built on mutual respect and genuine compatibility can thrive under conditions where traditional romantic marriages might struggle." Rebecca typically focused on practical advice for women facing difficult circumstances. "Desperation is not a weakness," she would say, "it's clarity about your true priorities. When you understand what you genuinely need versus what you think you should want, you can make decisions that serve your real interests rather than social expectations." Their reputation as successful, unconventional partners led to invitations from universities and religious organizations to speak about alternative family structures. Some audiences were skeptical, even hostile, but others were genuinely interested in understanding how partnerships based on mutual need rather than romantic attraction could succeed. Spring arrived again, bringing with it the second anniversary of Rebecca's arrival at James's cabin, and news that would cement their reputation as advocates for unconventional families. Catherine Walsh, the widow they had advised 2 years earlier, wrote to announce her marriage to a widowed rancher with 2 children of his own. The match had proven successful beyond everyone's expectations, creating a blended family of 6 that was thriving under circumstances that might have challenged traditional arrangements. "Your advice changed my life," Catherine wrote. "More than that, it gave me permission to be honest about what I needed and what I could offer. Instead of pretending to be someone I wasn't, I could present my true self and find someone who valued those authentic qualities." Similar letters arrived regularly, creating a collection of success stories that validated James and Rebecca's approach to partnership counseling. They began compiling these stories into a book, hoping to reach people who might not have access to personal consultation but could benefit from examples of successful, unconventional arrangements. As Thomas took his first steps across the cabin floor, supported by the enthusiastic encouragement of his adopted siblings, Rebecca reflected on the journey that had brought their extraordinary family together. What had begun as a desperate bargain between 2 lonely people had evolved into something richer and more meaningful than either had dared imagine. The mountain homestead that had once sheltered a single hermit now housed a thriving family of 6, connected to a network of similar families across the territory. Their success had inspired legislative changes, social programs, and countless individual success stories. Most importantly, it had proven that love could take many forms, and that partnerships built on honesty, respect, and mutual need could be just as meaningful as those based on traditional romantic attraction. Outside their windows, the first flowers of spring pushed through the last patches of snow, promising another season of growth, challenge, and possibility. Inside their warm home, 6 people who had found each other through circumstances that society might have deemed improper or desperate, continued the daily work of building something lasting from the raw materials of hope, determination, and the radical belief that everyone deserved a chance at happiness, regardless of age, circumstances, or the unconventional paths that might lead them there. 5 years after that first desperate winter, when Rebecca had begged James to accept her audacious proposition, the Mitchell homestead had become something neither of them could have envisioned during their initial awkward negotiations. The original cabin now served as the heart of a compound that included 3 additional buildings: a proper schoolhouse where Rebecca taught not only the 4 children but also the offspring of neighboring families, a workshop where James crafted furniture and tools that were sought after throughout the territory, and a guest house that accommodated the steady stream of visitors seeking guidance on unconventional partnerships. Thomas, now a sturdy 5-year-old with his father's quiet intensity and his mother's stubborn determination, had appointed himself protector of his younger adoptive aunt Emma, though at 9 years old she hardly needed protection. Sarah, at 13, displayed leadership qualities that reminded both James and Rebecca of what they might have been like had they possessed such confidence in their youth. Michael, 11, had developed into James's most dedicated apprentice, showing genuine talent for woodworking that promised future mastery of the craft. The territorial partnership program that James and Rebecca had helped establish had expanded beyond their wildest expectations. What began as informal advice-giving had evolved into a network of counselors across 7 territories, all trained in the principles they had developed through trial and error during their own unconventional courtship. Governor Stevens himself had visited the previous autumn, accompanied by a delegation of territorial officials interested in documenting their methods for potential implementation in other Western regions. The visit had terrified James initially, but he had found himself speaking with unexpected eloquence about the principles underlying successful, unconventional partnerships. Traditional matchmaking assumes that romantic attraction is the foundation of lasting unions, he had explained to the assembled officials, but partnerships built on mutual respect, shared values, and compatible goals often prove more durable than those based solely on initial emotional attachment. Rebecca had added her perspective on the practical considerations that many romantic matches overlooked. Passion fades, she had observed, but the ability to work together, to support each other through difficulties, to find satisfaction in shared accomplishments, these qualities create lasting bonds that survive the inevitable challenges of building a life together. The governor had been sufficiently impressed to authorize funding for a comprehensive study of their methods, conducted by scholars from the Territorial University. Dr. Margaret Thornfield, a professor of social sciences who specialized in family structures, had spent 3 months at the homestead documenting their daily routines, interviewing people they had counseled, and analyzing the long-term success rates of partnerships formed through their guidance. Her preliminary findings, shared in a letter that arrived with the spring supply wagon, were remarkable. Of the 43 partnerships they had directly advised over 5 years, 39 remained intact and reported high levels of satisfaction. The 4 that had dissolved had ended amicably, with both parties acknowledging that they had learned valuable lessons about their own needs and preferences. What you have achieved, Dr. Thornfield wrote, challenges fundamental assumptions about marriage, family formation, and the role of romantic love in creating lasting unions. Your success rates exceed those of conventional matchmaking by significant margins, and the stability of the partnerships you have facilitated suggests that your methods address genuine human needs that traditional approaches often overlook. The scholarly validation of their work opened new opportunities for influence and impact. Publishers in San Francisco and Chicago expressed interest in the book manuscript they had been developing, seeing potential for a work that could reach national audiences struggling with similar challenges as Western expansion continued. James found the prospect of such visibility both exciting and terrifying. Having strangers read our private thoughts, analyze our methods, judge our choices, he confided to Rebecca one evening as they reviewed publisher proposals. It feels like exposing ourselves to exactly the kind of scrutiny I spent 17 years avoiding. But think of the people we could help, Rebecca countered. Every letter we receive tells stories of desperation, loneliness, fear of growing, old alone. If our book could reach even a fraction of those people, could give them hope or practical guidance. The debate continued over several weeks, complicated by offers from lecture bureaus interested in booking them for speaking tours across the Western Territories. The financial opportunities were substantial, enough to ensure comfortable futures for all 4 children and fund expansion of their counseling services. But the personal costs seemed equally significant. It was Sarah who provided the perspective that ultimately influenced their decision. At 13, she possessed wisdom that belied her years, perhaps developed through early exposure to loss and uncertainty. You helped us when we had nowhere else to turn, she said during a family discussion about the publishing offers. You gave us a home, taught us that families can be built from choice as much as blood, showed us that unconventional doesn't mean inferior. Don't other people deserve the same chance? Michael, typically practical for an 11-year-old, added his own consideration. Besides, if you become famous for helping people, maybe more families like ours will be accepted instead of whispered about. Their decision to proceed with publication was influenced by a letter that arrived from an unexpected source. Rebecca's former sister-in-law, Caroline, writing from Philadelphia with news that fundamentally altered their understanding of their impact. "My dear Rebecca," Caroline wrote, "I must confess that your unconventional marriage has influenced my own thinking more than I initially admitted. Following my visit to your mountain home, I began observing the marriages in my own social circle with different eyes, noting how many were built on financial convenience, social expectations, or family pressure rather than genuine compatibility or affection." She continued, "I have become something of an advocate for marriages based on mutual respect and shared values rather than purely romantic attachment. Several widows in my circle have entered into partnerships that might be considered unconventional by Philadelphia standards, but which have proved more satisfying than their first marriages ever were." The letter revealed that their influence had extended far beyond the Western territories, affecting even the rigid social structures of Eastern society. Caroline had become an informal counselor to women facing circumstances similar to Rebecca's original situation, sharing adapted versions of the guidance she had observed during her mountain visit. "You have started something larger than you realize," Caroline concluded. "What you have built together is not just a successful marriage, but a model for how people might choose partners based on genuine compatibility rather than social convention." This unexpected validation from someone who had initially opposed their union provided the final motivation they needed to share their story more widely. They signed contracts with a Chicago publisher and agreed to a limited speaking tour that would take them to major cities across the Western Territories during the autumn months when travel was most feasible. The months of preparation required for publication and touring revealed new dimensions of their partnership. Rebecca proved to have unexpected talents for organizing complex logistics and managing correspondence with publishers, agents, and venue coordinators. James, meanwhile, discovered abilities in synthesizing their experiences into coherent principles that could be applied by others facing different but related challenges. Working together on the manuscript, they found themselves rediscovering aspects of their relationship that had been overlooked in the daily routines of managing a large household. The intellectual collaboration required for writing rekindled the kinds of conversations they had shared during those early winter evenings when they were first learning to trust each other. "Do you remember?" Rebecca asked one evening as they worked on a chapter about managing initial resistance to unconventional arrangements. "How terrified you were when I first arrived. How do you try to send me to sleep in the barn?" James laughed, a sound that would have been impossible during those early days of paralyzing social anxiety. "I remember thinking you were some kind of mad woman, showing up with propositions that seemed designed to destroy my carefully ordered life. And now I realize you weren't trying to destroy anything," James replied thoughtfully. "You were offering to build something neither of us could have created alone, something better than either of us had imagined possible." The book, titled Partnerships of Purpose, Finding Love Through Honest Need, was published in the spring of their 6th year together. Initial reviews were mixed, with some critics dismissing their approach as unromantic or calculating. But reader response was overwhelmingly positive, generating thousands of letters from people who recognized their own struggles in the stories James and Rebecca shared. One particularly moving letter came from a widower in Montana Territory who had used their guidance to form a successful partnership with a widow who had 3 young children. "You gave us permission to be practical about our needs without being ashamed of them," he wrote. "We have built a family based on mutual support and genuine affection, and our children are thriving in ways that might not have been possible if we had insisted on waiting for romantic love to solve our practical problems." Another came from a woman in Oregon who had escaped an abusive marriage and used their principles to evaluate potential new partners based on character and compatibility rather than superficial attraction. Your book helped me understand that I deserved respect and partnership, not just rescue, she wrote. The man I chose values my opinions, shares domestic responsibilities, and treats my children as if they were his own. The speaking tour that autumn proved both exhausting and exhilarating. James's terror at addressing large audiences gradually gave way to confidence as he realized that people genuinely wanted to hear what he had learned about building successful partnerships. Rebecca discovered a gift for connecting with audiences. That surprised even her, finding ways to share deeply personal experiences while maintaining the dignity and privacy that their unconventional family required. Audiences varied considerably, depending on location and venue. University gatherings tended to focus on theoretical questions about family structures and social evolution. Church groups were more concerned with moral and practical considerations. Women's organizations wanted specific advice about evaluating potential partners and protecting their interests in unconventional arrangements. But regardless of audience composition, certain questions arose repeatedly. How did they distinguish between desperation that led to poor choices and desperation that provided clarity about genuine needs? How did they evaluate character in potential partners who might not reveal their true nature immediately? How did they maintain individual dignity while acknowledging mutual dependence? Their answers, refined through dozens of presentations, became increasingly sophisticated. They developed frameworks for self-assessment, criteria for evaluating compatibility, and strategies for negotiating unconventional arrangements that protected both parties' interests. The key insight, Rebecca would typically explain, is that desperation can actually provide clarity about your true priorities. When you understand what you genuinely need versus what you think you should want, you can make decisions that serve your real interests rather than social expectations. James usually followed with practical considerations. Successful partnerships require honest assessment of what each person can contribute and what each person genuinely needs. Fantasy and self-deception destroy partnerships more quickly than external opposition or practical difficulties. By winter's end, they had spoken to over 10,000 people across 8 territories, generating enough interest to justify a second book focused specifically on practical guidance for forming unconventional partnerships. Publishers were already competing for rights to their next manuscript, and universities were offering positions that would allow them to formalize their research into family structures and partnership formation. But perhaps the most meaningful validation of their work came from an unexpected source. Thomas, now 6 years old and precociously articulate, who had begun asking questions about why his family was different from others he observed during their travels. "Are we unconventional?" he asked one evening, as the family gathered around the fireplace in their expanded cabin. Rebecca and James exchanged glances, recognizing the importance of this conversation not just for Thomas, but for all 4 children who were growing up in a family that defied traditional categories. "We're unconventional in some ways," Rebecca acknowledged. "Your father and I didn't meet through romantic courtship. We chose each other based on practical considerations and mutual need. Sarah, Michael, and Emma joined our family through adoption, rather than birth." Thomas considered this information with the seriousness that characterized all his important thinking. "But we love each other, right? We take care of each other?" "Absolutely," James confirmed. "We may have formed our family in unconventional ways, but the love and care we share are as real as in any family." Sarah, now 14 and increasingly thoughtful about adult relationships, added her perspective. "I think what makes us special is that everyone chose to be here, Nobody's stuck with us because of blood relations or legal obligations. We're all here because we want to be. It was a profound observation that captured something essential about their success. Each member of their unconventional family had chosen their place in it, creating bonds of affection and loyalty that were voluntary rather than imposed by circumstance or obligation. As spring returned to their mountain refuge for the seventh time since Rebecca's desperate arrival, the Mitchell household had become something unprecedented in their region, a family that openly challenged conventional assumptions about marriage, parenthood, and kinship, while demonstrating that alternative approaches could produce results as meaningful and lasting as traditional arrangements. Their story had evolved from personal desperate measures to regional legend to national phenomenon, inspiring thousands of people to reconsider their assumptions about love, partnership, and family formation. But at its heart, it remained what it had always been, the story of two lonely people who had found the courage to choose each other honestly and who had built something beautiful from the raw materials of mutual need, careful attention, and the radical belief that everyone deserved a chance at happiness. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.